Well, good morning, everybody. I'm John OLoughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this morning, it's Sunday. It's very unusual for me to broadcast on a Sunday, but from time to time, I find something that I just really want to share with you. And this is one of those times. It's a book that I think really does help me in understanding the scenario behind the scenes during my father's career and life, and then also to look into what's really going on today in terms of the deep state. And one of the interesting questions that's been raised lately, and I think Mark Kulak has done a good job of raising this issue, is whether or not it's accurate for us to look at the deep state as this big monolith, this empire that's imposing itself upon us and stealing our freedoms from us, or is it more realistic to think of it as a struggle between powerful factions within this deep state that is causing all of the impacts upon us? And if the second thing is true, then we need to readjust our thinking in terms of we're not just us against them, but it's them against them. And we are basically being used as pawns in their chess game. So we've looked at the Vietnam War and the 60s and the early 70s from my father's point of view. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Good morning, Kevin. Glad to have you. And Maureen, Ann, thanks for being here. Um, I have not talked to George in a couple days. I think he's visiting family, so we'll have to see what's up with him when he resurfaces. Pardon me a second. Oh, I forgot to use my mute button. When I first started the show, everybody was like, John, you got to get a mute button. You can't just drink your coffee on live audio. So, long story short, I got one now, and I need to use it. Isn't that great? I've looked at the conflict, the war in Southeast Asia from the point of view of the deep state making money through the Golden Triangle and the heroin sales. And what's really been my theme as has been that my dad was on one side of kind of what you might call the old army or old navy or old, just the old American um, viewpoint, and the Dulles brothers and the New England establishment, where my dad's uncle worked for the Hartford Insurance Company. They was on the other side, and those guys were profiting from the dope deals that my dad tried to bust in the TDY operation. And that, I think, all is accurate, and we're still going with that model. However, I've also spoken of what has appeared to me to be competing imperial interests, which you can easily see between the two army generals, MacArthur and Donovan, right? So MacArthur is pursuing the old American Westward Ho empire, manifest destiny, extended into Hawaii, for instance, and then of course the Philippines, and where his father was stationed, and the horrible, American military efforts to take over those places, just in complete defiance of the rights of the indigenous people, and in many cases, committing genocidal acts to gain control of that territory. For whom? For the American elites of that particular um, group. In recognizing the incredible wealth of Asia, the corporations of the Northeast were not ready to cede Asia to the old guard types like MacArthur. And so they were trying to get their intelligence officers into that theater in World War II. And that's part of one of the chapters of my book, Macduff Lives, is how he was there on the Nashville when Donovan and MacArthur had their classic blowout. Well, this book, as often seems to be the case, has written a lot of what I was thinking, you know, back 45 years ago, 50 years ago. This gentleman, Carl Oglesby, was thinking along those same lines, and so this book I'm going to start reading from in order to give us an entirely different perspective and to try to give a more accurate answer to the question: Are we facing one monolith, or are we facing a competing group, both within the United States and then, of course, around the world, which is beyond the subject of this book? So let's look into this publication from way back in 1974 or 5, I believe. I'm going to try and share the screen so you can see it. There. Let's do it the other way. There. Okay. And so that way you can see as I read from it. The astonishing link between the JFK assassination and the deposing of Nixon. Notice the word deposing. Conspiracies from Dallas to Watergate and beyond. Startling new material on the Carter connection. And then the title, The Yankee and Cowboy War. Stimulating, lucid, and exciting, says Norman Mailer. And the book by Carl Oglesby. Let's just, oops, I'm sorry, I have to go over to the other page to make those buttons work, don't I? So there they are. All of the usual suspects. President Kennedy, up in the upper left, I believe that's Carter when he still had hair. Um, Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. Then, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald, at the moment he's being shot by Jack Ruby, a armed gunman pointing in the direction of Fidel Castro, Howard Hughes in the lower right, and a Central Intelligence Agency medallion bearing on the front of it what it's a kind of a NATO type of seal, and then standing in front of that a soldier, which obviously is not a liberal Western soldier, perhaps somebody working for one of the fascist governments in South America. Now we see, okay, there's Connolly up in the upper right, Johnson on the left, Nixon, of course, Ehrlichman, and down in the center, right above the Watergate hotel itself, looks like John Dean. Dallas and Watergate are concrete links in a chain of ominous events, a hidden drama of coup and counter-coup which represents the life of an inner power sphere, an invisible government capable of any act, setting itself above the law and beyond moral rule, a clandestine American state. Okay, 1976, long time ago. 1976, I was just getting introduced to traditional fiddle music. I was starting at Georgetown University Law Center in the evening division. I was working my butt off for various law firms in the DC area as a law clerk. And I was just about to start playing music on Friday nights as a respite from the stress of legal world, both working as a law clerk and studying, of course. So 1976, I played music at the 1976 exhibition, the Smithsonian Centennial exhibition, the Bicentennial exhibition, which was a kind of a copy of the 1876, which meant that we got to play some old music for them. The assassination of John Kennedy and the downfall of Richard Nixon have both been viewed as isolated moral disasters for American democracy. Kennedy's murder as a demonstration of our continuing national inability or unwillingness to cope with violence. Nixon's downfall is a demonstration of the failure of our democratic institutions to overcome the abuses of secret intelligence and electronic surveillance at the seat of national power. But these two events represent neither isolated disasters nor a generalized failure of American institutions, but something almost beyond the ability of ordinary people even to see, much less control. The two events, Dallas and Watergate, are actually concrete links in a chain of related and ominous events passing through the entire decade in which they occurred and beyond. And this chain of events itself represents only the violent eruptions of a deeper struggle of rival power elites identified here as Yankees and Cowboys. This book proposes to show that Dallas and Watergate are intrinsically linked conspiracies in a hidden drama of coup and counter coup, which represents the life of an inner oligarchic power sphere and, quote, invisible government, capable of any act in the pursuit of its objectives that sets itself above the law and beyond the moral rule, a clandestine American state, perhaps an embryonic police state. We see the expressions and symptoms of clandestine America in a dozen places now. The FBI's COINTELPRO scheme, the CIA's Operation Chaos, the Pentagon's Operation Garden Plot, the large-scale and generally successful attempts to destroy legitimate and essential dissent in which all the intelligence agencies participated, a campaign whose full scope and fury are still not revealed. We see it in the ruthlessness and indifference to world as well as national opinion with which the CIA contracted its skills out to ITT to destroy democracy's last little chance in Chile. We see it as well, as this book argues, in the crime and cover up of Dealey Plaza, the crime and cover up of Watergate. How could the clandestine state have stricken us so profoundly? How could we, as we might have fancied, quote, of all people, unquote, have given way with so little resistance, in fact, with so little evident understanding of what was happening? What accounts for the way the various organs of state force, defense, and security alike became so divided against each other? CIA intelligence against CIA operations. The CIA, the Pentagon, the FBI, and the presidency at one time or another against each other. What is this internal conflict all about? Why should the country's premier political coalition, formed after Reconstruction and reformed by Franklin Roosevelt, have begun to destabilize so badly in the 1960s and 1970s? The intensification of clandestine, illicit methods against racial and anti war dissent as a threat to the secret state precisely coincided with the intensified use of such methods in conflicts for power and hegemony taking place within the secret state against a background of declining consensus. The Dallas to Watergate outburst is fundamentally attributable to the breakdown taking place within the incumbent national coalition, the coalition of the greater Northeastern powers with the greater Southwestern powers, the post Civil War, post Reconstruction coalition, the coalition of the New Deal, of Yankees and Cowboys. This is the theme at bottom of the entire narration to follow, the agony of the Yankees and the Cowboys. The cause of their divergence in the later Cold War period is that there was finally too much tension between the detentist strategy of the Yankees in the Atlantic and the militarist strategy of the Cowboys in the Pacific. To maintain the two lines was, in effect, to maintain two separate and opposed realities at once, two separate and contradictory domains of world historical truth. In Europe and the industrial world, the evident truth was that we could live with communism. In Asia and the Third World, the evident truth was that we could not, that we had to fight and win wars against it, or else face terrible consequences at home. As long as the spheres of détente and violence could be kept apart in American policy and consciousness, as long as the Atlantic and Pacific could remain two separate planes of reality, wheeling within each other on opposite assumptions and never colliding, then American foreign policy could wear a look of reasonable integration. But when it became clear that the United States could not win its way militarily in the Third World without risking a nuclear challenge in the North Atlantic, the makings of a dissolving consensus were at hand. I argue in part two of this book that the power elite collision one sensed at Dallas on November 22nd, 1963 was real. It was no chance collision of a lone political maniac with a lone political star. It was a collision anchored in the larger social dialectic that propels the life of the national ruling elites. The conspiracy to kill JFK and the much larger conspiracy to keep official silence embodied this collision and had there being in this, sorry, let me catch that. The conspiracy to kill JFK and the much larger conspiracy to keep official silence embodied this collision and had there being in this the opposition of Yankee and Cowboy. The lines of division became clear early in 1968 with the rapid crystallizing of a whole new front of opposition to the war, that of the quote corporate liberals unquote. Formerly, the established liberalism of the sort we associate with Xerox and Harvard had been inclined to defend the U.S. position in Vietnam as part of its long-standing general commitment to anti-communism. The Yankee Lights had made the usual arrangements to provide world banking services to a free South Vietnam and take the oil from its waters. And it was always clear that there would be no serious objection from the Yankees as a whole if the Vietnam War turned out to be winnable. But now, in 1967 to 68, a new line of criticism of Johnson and his war policy opened up. The war's costs had exploded out of all proportion to the original objective, one now heard. No vital American interests were being attacked or defended in Vietnam after all. Europe was appalled at us. Our European alliances were suffering. Our young people were strenuously alienated. Our economy was hurting. Other problems were lying neglected. We needed to wrap up the bleeding stump and move to a better position. General James Gavin, for example, one of President Kennedy's chief military advisors, developed these and related ideas about the war in various public forums during that period. But the strategy that was continued by Nixon in 1969 and the aftermath of the Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy assassinations and Nixon's resultant re-election was, of course, escalation, the secret air war, the invasion of the sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos, the Christmas bombings, etc. But for a moment in 1968, Johnson had suddenly and strangely abdicated, stopping the bombing and opened the Paris peace talks. And Robert Kennedy had assembled an electoral coalition reaching from Mayor Daley to the liberal peaceniks, if not Tom Hayden, a new politics style coalition that appeared easily capable of beating Nixon, taking office, and stopping the war with a thump. Pardon me. It's um it's pretty interesting so far, isn't it? I think of all of this going on as I think in terms of the years of my dad's career, and in 67, of course, is when the TDY mission happens. So I can see that being right at the cusp of this transition when the Northeastern liberals abandoned their total containment policy in favor of cutting their losses in Vietnam and, at least in theory, shifting money to domestic programs to satisfy their progressive wing, right? And isn't it interesting that this is the same thing that's going on with Afghanistan right now? With Biden, why is Biden pulling out of Afghanistan, leaving disaster behind, leaving the Taliban to take over the country, after wasting, billions of dollars and American lives and putting our soldiers through hell, to say nothing of the hell we put the people of Afghanistan through? Is it not the same pattern? Just like when we skedaddled from Vietnam, because, well, things change, so you make money one way and then that one dries up, and so you move on to something else. But when my father goes out there or sends the mission out there into Laos, he didn't go, of course, he was in the Pentagon. He was fighting the war. He was fighting on the side of the Cowboys, right? Because it's the CIA that's using the war as a way to make money for its further clandestine activities. That's not something that the cowboy side would do. Not that they're not imperialists. Look at the Admiral Mann and all of his writings, and the general idea that the American, the empire of liberty is a place where, yes, we have liberty, but we finance it with an empire. But that was an empire of the dreams of the what our author Carl Oglesby calls the Cowboys. Big Mac, I will have to purchase this book. All of this seems to help me hone my understanding of the world. I'm so glad to see you read that. I mean, to read you saying that, Big Mac, because we're trying very desperately to do exactly that here at my channel to help people take a look behind the curtain and to see how easy it is really to pull that curtain back once you get a hold of some real facts that you can pull on, and you can pull this curtain back, and then you realize that, hey, somebody else has already done this for you. And that's what happened when I found this book yesterday. I said, wow, this writer has really uh, done a lot of the work that I don't have to do. I just read his book. So, whereas there had formerly appeared to be an essential agreement at the top of the American power structure on the Vietnam question, now we had two ruling class voices to account for. One demanding more military effort and insisting upon the necessity of the original objective. The other tiring of the frustrations and costs of the attempt, unwilling to sacrifice resources at a yet higher magnitude, and wanting to be free to worry about other things: oil, gold, the Mideast, Europe, the economy, and so on. It was directly clear that there was a regional component to this difference. Of course, there are major points that do not fit the Yankee Cowboy curve. The West Coast Bank of America, for example, spoke through the period of maximum unrest over the war with an essentially liberal voice. And Fulbright is from Arkansas, but on balance, the souls most fervently desirous of decisive military measures to prevent a communist takeover tended to argue from a frontierist, China lobby kind of position. And the souls most calmly able to accept losses and pull back tended to argue from an Atlanticist, Council on Foreign Relations, NATO haunted kind of position. The Yankee Cowboy split thus suggested itself as a not too simplistic way to indicate in swift available terms the existence of a rich and complex rivalry, the general cultural disposition of its chief contending principles, and the jointly historical and mythic character of their struggle, commingling John Wayne fantasies with real bloodshed, real genocide. The profile of these types is best suggested in the persons and relationship of the corporate banker monopolist David Rockefeller and tycoon entrepreneur Howard Hughes. An inquiry into their long rivalry is the first step into our exposition of Watergate in Part 3. But the spirit of Yankeeness is given off by many things besides the Chase Manhattan, and of cowboyness by many things beside the Hughes Empire. Yankeeness is the Ivy League, and cowboyness is the NFL. Yankee is the exclusive clubs of Manhattan, Boston, and Georgetown. Cowboy is the exclusive clubs of Dallas and New Orleans, Orange County, East and West. Yankee is the Council on Foreign Relations, the secret Round Table, Eleanor Roosevelt, Bundles for Britain, and at a certain point, the Dulles brothers and the doctrine. Oh, pardon me, didn't hear that one coming. Pardon me. And the Dulles brothers and the doctrine of massive retaliation. Cowboy is Johnson, Connolly, Howard Hunt, and the Bay of Pigs team. Yankee is Kennedy, Cowboy is Nixon. But I stress my purpose is not to name a concrete group of conspirators and assassins, though I do not doubt that the conspiracies I speak of are actual. My aim rather is to call attention to the persistence of Civil War splits in the current situation and to the historical ideological substance of the positions at play. It must be often the case, as it was with me and the Yankee Cowboy idea, that one's fresh insight turns out to be already well mapped and settled. I first proposed the Yankee Cowboy reference in early 1968, but wrote nothing of any account on the theme until a series of articles about Watergate for the Boston Phoenix in 1973 and 4. A reader of one of those pieces informed me of the similarity of my views to those of Professor Carroll Quigley, a historian at Georgetown. Quigley is the author of a huge book about the contemporary world, tragedy and hope, to which I will return in chapter 2. I begin my debt to Quigley here by borrowing the following observation from his summary, noting that since 1950, a revolutionary change has been occurring in American politics. Quigley says that this transformation involves, quote, a disintegration of the middle class and a corresponding increase in significance by the petty bourgeoisie at the same time that the economic influence of the older Wall Street financial groups has been weakening and been challenged by new wealth springing up outside the eastern cities, notably in the Southwest and Far West, unquote. He continues. These new sources of wealth have been based very largely on government action and government spending, but have nonetheless adopted a petty bourgeois outlook rather than the semi aristocratic outlook that pervades the Eastern establishment. This new wealth, based on petroleum, natural gas, ruthless exploitation of national resources, the aviation industry, military bases in the South and West, and finally on space with all its attendant activities, has centered in Texas and Southern California. Its existence for the first time made it possible for the petty bourgeois outlook to make itself felt in the political nomination process instead of in the unrewarding effort to influence politics by voting for a Republican candidate nominated under Eastern establishment influence. By the 1964 election, the major political issue in the country was the financial struggle behind the scenes between the old wealth, civilized and cultured in its foundations, and the new wealth, virile and uninformed, arising from the flowing profits of government dependent corporations in the Southwest and West. Unquote. The whole point of introducing the cowboy Yankee language, of course, is to bring precisely that old money, new money, Atlanticist, frontierist tension into focus in the plane of current events. The main idea of looking at things this way is to see that a sectional rivalry derived from the patterns of the Civil War still operates in American politics. Indeed, that at that altitude of national power elites, it may be the most sensitive and inflamed division of all, more concentrated than race and class, and more basic than the two party system attachments and ideologies. The argument of this book is that the emerging clash of Yankee and Cowboy wills beneath the visible stream of events is the dominant fact of real U.S. political life since 1960. The dissolution of the Yankee Cowboy consensus of World War II and the Cold War until 1960 is behind the Dallas of Kennedy and the Watergate of Nixon. Let us go a step further with these types, Cowboy and Yankee, and sketch a first outline of the differing worlds they see. The Yankee mind of global scope is at home in the great world, used to regarding it as a whole thing integrated in the far flung activities of Western exploration, conquest, and commerce. The Yankee believes that the basis of a good world order is the health of America's alliances across the North Atlantic, the relations with the Western democracies from which our tradition mainly flows. He believes that the United States continues the culture of Europe and relates to the Atlantic as to a lake whose other shore must be secured as a matter of domestic priority. Europe is the key world theater, and it is self evident to the Yankee mind that the fate of the United States is inevitably linked up with Europe's in a career of white cultural destiny, transcending national boundaries. That a community of a unified world civilization exists, that there is such a thing as, quote, the West, quote, one world, unquote. The cowboy mind has no room for the assumption that American and European culture are continuous. The cowboy is moved instead by the discontinuity of the New World from the Old and substitutes for the Yankees' Atlantic oriented culture a new system of culture. And in parentheses, the titles of two important movies, Big Sky and Giant, oriented to an expanding wilderness frontier and based on an advanced Pacific strategy. The Yankee monopolists who first broke faith with the goal of military victory in Vietnam did so in view of what they saw as the high probability of failure and the certain ambiguity of success. The cowboy entrepreneurs who fought hardest to keep the faith alive did so out of conviction of the necessity of success. Said the multi-corporate liberal Yankee about 1968, quote, the United States cannot wage a winning non-nuclear land campaign in Asia. It will destroy its much more essential relations in Europe if, in spite of all wisdom, its leadership continues to siphon off precious national blood and treasure to win this war. It is necessary to stand down, unquote. Said the cowboy, only the strong are free, unquote. The distinction between the East Coast monopolist and the Western tycoon entrepreneur is the main class economic distinction set out by the Yankee cowboy perspective. It arises because one naturally looks for a class economic basis for this apparent conflict at the summit of American power. That is because one must assume that parties without a class economic base could not endure struggle at that height. It is then only necessary to recall that anti war feeling struck the Eastern establishment next after it struck the students, the teachers, and the clergy, struck the large bank connected firms tied to the transatlantic business grid. During the same period, industrial segments around the construction industry, the military industrial complex, agribusiness, the southern boom of the 60s and 70s, and independent Texas Southwest oil interests, that is, the forces Quigley calls New Wealth, never suffered a moment of war weariness. They supported the Texan Johnson and the Southern Californian Nixon as far as they would go toward a final military solution. Why should this difference have arisen? After a century of Northeastern leadership and one quarter century of Cold War unity, why should the national ruling coalition of the old and new owning classes, I like that term, owning classes, Yankee and Cowboy, have been pulling apart? But then we have to go back. What was the basis of their unity to begin with? William Appleman Williams deals with a variation of this question when he argues that the basis for the long term general or pluralist coalition of the forces of capitalism, or plutocracy meaning ruled by the wealthy, with the forces of democracy in American politics is the constant companionship of the expanding wilderness frontier. Williams thus stands the Turner frontier on its head, correcting it. I add that another and cognate effect of the frontier in American economic development was to preserve the entrepreneurial option long after the arrival of the vast monopoly structures which tend to consume entrepreneurs. In the states where political economic histories Marx studied, for example, the frontier was never the factor that it was in America, except as America itself was Europe's Wild West. The rugged individualist, self made rich man, the autonomous man of power, the wildcatter, began to drop out of sight, to lose presence as individual, type, and class with the rise of the current day computer centered monopoly corporate formations. The tycoon entrepreneur is, of course, disappearing as a type in America, too, at least as a political force in national life. The Hughes empire at last has been corporatized. Old Man Hunt is dead. His sons are bringing Harvard Business School rational bureaucracy to the operation. But that only makes it all the more curious that political power continued to emanate from the type and the person, the image and the reality, the ghost perhaps of a creature like Hughes, as late as the second victorious presidential campaign of Nixon. Why should the cowboy tycoon have persisted so long as a political force, competent to struggle against the biggest banking cartels for control of the levers of national power? As others have argued, the frontier was a reprieve for democracy. We may note here that it was also a reprieve for capitalism as well, whose internal conflicts were constantly being financed off an endless seeming input of vast stretches of natural riches, having no origin in capitalist production. All that was needed was for the settlers to accept the genocidal elimination of the native population, and a great deal became possible. The Purple Mountains, the fruited plains, and generation after generation of American whites were able to accept that program. The Indian Wars won the West. The railroads and highways were laid. The country was resettled by a new race, a new nation. Energies of expansion consumed the continent in about 2 centuries, pushing on to Hawaii and Alaska. There is no way to calculate the impact of that constant territorial expansion on the development of American institutions. There is no way to imagine those institutions apart from the environment created by that expansion. It is a matter our standard national hagiography paints out of the picture. Though we make much of the populist saga aspect of the pioneering, never conquering, of the West, how can we congratulate our national performance for its general democracy and constitutionalism without taking into account the background of that constant expansion? We do not teach our children that we are Democrats in order to expand forever and Republicans on condition of an unfrozen Western boundary with unclaimed wilderness. To the extent that the American miracle of pluralism exists at all, we still do not know how miraculous it would be in the absence of an expanding frontier, its constant companion till the time of the Chinese Revolution. The overwar in Asia had its internal American origin in the native reflex to maintain the Western frontier on the old terms, and to do so at all cost, since our whole way of life hinges on the frontier. What the late blooming Yankee liberal critics of the Vietnam War refused to hear and recognize between the lines of the pro war arguments of the more philosophical cowboy hawks was this essential point about the importance of frontier expansion in American life from the beginning. Just checking the clock. I'm going to try to wrap up at noon. In the nature of things, the American frontier continued to expand with the prosperity it financed. Now, in our generation, it has brought us to this particular moment of world confrontation across the Pacific, fully global in scale for both sides, fully modern in its technological expression for both sides, the old westward surging battle for space projected onto the stage of superpowers. The success and then the successful defense from 1950 to 1975 of the Asian revolutionary nationalist campaigns against further dominance, Western dominance in Asia, China, Korea, Vietnam, means that all that is changed. What was once true about the space to the west of America is no longer true and will never be true again. There will never be a time again when the white adventurer may peer over his western horizon at an Asia helplessly plunged in social disorganization. In terms of their social power to operate as a unified people and in the assimilation of technology, the Chinese people are, since 1950, a self modernizing people, not colonials anymore. And instead of a Wild West, Americans now have a mature common boundary with other moderns like ourselves, not savages, not redskins, not reds, only quote modern people like ourselves in a single modern world, unquote. This is new for us, a new experience for Americans altogether. Our national transformation from an unbounded to a bounded state will, of course, continue to stir the internal furies. No one interpretation of the event will be able to establish itself. No one will agree what the end of the frontier means, what it will lead to, what one ought to do about it. But we all will agree that it is upon us and past, whether it is called one thing or another. And now, after Vietnam, as though it were not clear enough before, it is apparent beyond any possibility of doubt that whatever this force of Asian self modernization is, whether it is evil or good or beyond good and evil, it is assuredly not a force that the United States policymakers can manhandle and manipulate and hold back through diplomatic chicanery and military force, even if it were still advisable for the United States to stop, quote, the march of Asian communism, unquote, if that is what we are really talking about. It is not possible for the United States to do that. Look and see China, Korea, Vietnam. I have not written this book to say at the end, choose sides between Cowboy and Yankee for Civil War II. My less bloody belief is that ordinary people all over the map, northeast by southwest, have a deep, simple, and common need to oppose all these intrigues and intriguers, whatever terms one calls them by, and however one understands their development. But this need, of course, must be recognized, and that is why I write. To offer an analysis of the situation of domestic politics from the standpoint of power elite collisions taking place at the top, and then, at the end, to suggest that democracy's first response must be to demand a realistic reconstruction of the assassination of President Kennedy. How long will they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? To comprehend his murder, as with the murder of Lincoln, is to comprehend a very basic event in the history of American government, as well as the crimes that came after it. The comprehension of these covert political actions is the absolute precondition of self government. Yes, the first step towards the restoration of the legitimate state. Yes, undo the coup. More broadly, I write to say that we are the American generations for whom the frontier is the fact that there is no more frontier, and who must somehow begin to decide how to deal with this. What shall America do about the loss of its wilderness frontier? Can we form our nation anew on new, non expansionist terms without first having to see everything old swept violently away? The unarticulated tension around that question undermined the long standing Yankee Cowboy coalition and introduced, with President Kennedy's assassination, the current period of violent and irregular movement at the top of the power hierarchy. It is the precipitous and at that same time unfocused character of this question of the closed, lost frontier that has created such a challenge, such a threat to traditional American values and institutions, the threat of a cancerously spreading clandestine state within. And thus ends chapter one of the Yankee and Cowboy Wars. War by Carl Oglesby. And I think, you know, he is saying what was saying when I first started my show. He's saying undo the coup of November 22nd, 1963, when government of the people, by the people, and for the people was overthrown in favor of one of these inside oligarchies, the Cowboys or the Indians. I mean, the Cowboys are the Yankees. Yeah. Okay, I think I've said enough for this morning. No, we love the Indians. This is the Southwest, you know, the oil guys, Murchison and all that. Howard Hughes. But Howard Hughes, apparently, if we, from our reading from Andy Craig and Presidential Puppetry, Howard Hughes got took down by Robert Mayhew, who was infiltrating and kind of taking Hughes down as an independent actor. Well, perhaps we'll learn more about that from Carl Oglesby when we read the next portion of his book. Thanks for being with me this morning. Have a great day.